Hi everybody. This lecture is part 2 of our module on the elements and principles of design as they relate to landscape design, and more specifically for this class, the creation of planting schemes. In this unit, we're going to focus on the principles of design. The principles of design provide us with guidelines on how we can combine the elements of design, line, color, texture, and form, in an aesthetically pleasing way. By the end of this module, you'll be able to name the main principles of design, describe ways in which the principles of design can be applied in planting schemes, and identify the use of these principles in living landscapes. We looked at this diagram in the lecture on the elements of design, but let's just refresh our memories about the design process. We start with finding out the client's wishes and how they use or would like to use their landscape. We also carry out a detailed site evaluation to assess all the factors that will influence plant growth and factors that will influence plant selection. During the site evaluation, we usually make notes on a base plan of the site and, of course, take lots of photos. Having completed the site evaluation and established the client's wishes, we can start to consider how we can organize or arrange the plants and other landscape features. It's usual to start with the largest plants first, as they have the most influence over the landscape, both visually and in terms of how they might alter site conditions. We can use the elements and principles of design to help us organize the plants in an aesthetically pleasing way, and the result of all these stages in the design process should be a functional, ecologically healthy, sustainable design that makes the client happy. Let's take a closer look at what the principles of design are as they relate to plants and planting schemes. Like the elements of design, the principles of design relate to any form of art. They're fundamental concepts that we can use to organize the elements of design, color, line, texture, and form in an aesthetically pleasing way. And the basic principles of design are proportion and scale, order and balance, repetition, and unity. These principles are strongly interlinked, and applying one usually helps achieve at least one of the others. It's important to remember, though, that these principles aren't formulae, and their application doesn't necessarily guarantee that a design solution will be aesthetically pleasing. Let's start by looking at proportion and scale. These two terms, proportion and scale, are often used interchangeably. But strictly speaking, scale refers to the size of landscape features in relation to their wider surroundings, whereas proportion relates to the size of landscape features relative to each other within that particular landscape. We usually consider proportion relative to the size of the house or the main structure. We may also consider it relative to the size of the area to be planted and the surrounding plants. In design, when features are in proportion, it means that there's visual balance. Sometimes we have no control over scale. It's hard to imagine that a single-story house like the one here in the photo is ever going to be in scale relative to a grove of giant redwoods. Going back to the lecture on the elements of design, though, look how much visual weight this small building has by being painted white. The white really makes it stand out against the dark background, which isn't necessarily a good thing here from an aesthetic point of view. Look how much less visual weight the darker colored building, that's actually bigger, has just by virtue of being painted a different color. It sits better in its surroundings, which means it looks more like it belongs here. It also helps that there's a larger tree next to this building, and this provides some visual continuity between the height and mass of the giant redwoods behind and the building. If we were the landscape designer in this situation, we could suggest that a similar tree be planted closer to the small white house, so that it would look more in scale with its surroundings. So maybe a tree, maybe there, something like that. While that would be a possible aesthetic solution, it wouldn't be a practical solution from a fire risk management point of view, or from branches heavy with snow in the winter breaking and falling on the house. This is a really good example of why landscape design is different to other art forms. We have to take into account so many other considerations in addition to just the aesthetics. Here we've got two diagrams of the same two-story house. The general rule of thumb for the scale of plants that are planted right up against the house is that they shouldn't be much more than about 3/4 of the height of the house walls. For trees that are planted further out or away from the house, ideally they shouldn't grow to more than about twice the height of the house, if the trees and the house are going to look in proportion to each other. The idea is to make the house look as if it belongs to the landscape, not to have it look as if it's floating or was just plopped there from outer space. The small white house in the previous slide looked like that. The house on the right here is floating in groupings of short plants that aren't in scale with the size of the house. The house on the left looks as if it belongs with its landscape, as the taller trees connect the large house with the lower growing plants. I'm not suggesting this is a perfect layout, having the house framed like this. I'm just saying that having the larger trees puts it all in proportion. The taller trees also provide interconnection, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. In textbooks on landscape design, order is defined as the big picture or the overall framework or organization of a design. And it refers to the spatial layout of the design. I have to admit that I find this a rather nebulous concept, and I find it much easier to understand when we talk about how order can be achieved through balance. Balance is the concept of equal visual attraction and weight, sometimes around a real or an imaginary central axis. How we use and place the elements of design affects balance. And balance can be either symmetrical or asymmetrical. Symmetrical balance is often used in formal gardens and is one of the oldest landscape layouts in Western Europe, where it was used extensively from the 13th through the 19th centuries, mainly to demonstrate humans' control over nature. The photo here is of one of the pond gardens at Hampton Court Palace in the south of England, not far from London. Originally, these areas were ponds which provided fish for the kitchens of Henry VIII, but they were changed to sunken gardens in the 1690s by Queen Mary II and laid out in a formal Dutch style. This landscape clearly has balance. The layout is perfectly symmetrical along two axes, so along here and horizontally like that. And even the seasonal plantings along these borders on the edges there are symmetrical. Here's another example of a landscape that is balanced through the use of symmetry. This is the Villa of Frucy de Rothschild in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat in the south of France, just east of Nice. This garden was built between 1905 and 1912, and although the gardens were intended to be enjoyed at ground level, they were also intended to be admired from above, and the view here is from a second-floor balcony, where you can really appreciate the symmetrical layout along this broad central axis. Here's a nice example of balance through symmetry on a much smaller and more modern scale. And it shows a really good use of the small space to the side of this house. Asymmetrical balance is achieved by the equal visual weight of design elements, form, color, or texture. A design balanced by asymmetry can feel much more casual and informal, and can also provide more points of interest. In this design by Pete Veyer of East Bay Wilds in Oakland, the Ray Hartman Ceanothus in the foreground is a focal point, and its canopy has a large visual weight. It's balanced asymmetrically on the other side of the path by the massed grouping here of the California coffee bush and then the Douglas iris as you go around the path. Russell Page, who was a famous British landscape architect, once said that the most striking and satisfying visual pleasure comes from the repetition or the massing of one simple element. And one of the principles of design is repetition. Repetition is created by the repeated use of elements of design or of features to create patterns or a sequence. Take a moment to look at the photo on the right and make a mental note of which elements are repeated here. Here's a photo of a garden that you saw in the lecture on the elements of design when I was talking about line. Look at this photo again now and make a mental note of the elements of design that you see repeated here. What colors are repeated? What lines are repeated? What textures and shapes? And while repetition can be a good thing, too much of it can be monotonous, as shown in this picture on the right, where just too much white makes this landscape very, very cold and very monotonous. Here's another shot of that white garden. This photo was taken at Bushart Gardens in Brentwood Bay, British Columbia. Bushart is famous for its spectacular displays of seasonal colour, which are changed 3 times a year. Massed plantings of seasonal colour may not be your thing, and they're not really mine. And they're certainly not a good example of sustainable landscaping. But these gardens are spectacular, and the level, the standard of maintenance at these gardens is absolutely superb. So if you ever find yourself up in British Columbia, then I strongly recommend that you go visit Bushart Gardens. From a design point of view, this landscape works because of the application of the principles of design: scale, proportion, and repetition. There are also examples of the use of unity through dominance, although I haven't talked about that principle yet. So what elements of design do you see here, and what elements of design do you see repeated? I see repeated patterns, I see repeated dominant colors, and I see focal points here, and then in the background right there. And the focal points are a good example of unity through dominance, which is another principle of design. Unity is achieved by linking design elements and landscape features to create a consistent character in the composition. Unity is sometimes referred to as harmony, meaning everything fits together. Unity can be achieved in a variety of ways by using dominance, interconnection, unity of 3, and simplicity to arrange colors, textures, and form. Let's talk about unity by dominance first. Dominance refers to the ability of a feature in the landscape to draw our attention. Dominance probably isn't the best term, as personally I think it tends to imply that one element or feature sticks out more than others, and not necessarily in a good way. Prominent would probably be a slightly better term, but I'm going to stick with dominance because that's what all the textbooks on design use. The dominant feature can be a structure, like a gazebo or an arbor, for example. It can be an object, such as a piece of sculpture or a water feature, or it can be a plant. Dominant features that capture our attention are referred to as focal points. When we're using a plant as a focal point, we often refer to the plant as a specimen plant. Focal points draw our attention to a particular point and guide our eye through the landscape. Without a dominant feature in a composition, our eye tends to wander restlessly through the landscape because it has nowhere to settle. As far as plants are concerned, dominance can be achieved by a change in one or more of the elements of design, so perhaps a change in size, color, form, or texture. We need to take care, though, that the dominant element does still have some characteristics in common with the other elements, so it continues to feel like it's part of the composition, like it belongs in the landscape. Here's a picture of a piece of sculpture in the sculpture park near the waterfront up in Seattle. And although this is a really fun piece of sculpture, I think this is a great example of a piece of sculpture that really looks like it doesn't belong in the landscape. Here's an example of unity by dominance. This is the gazebo at the Elizabeth F. Gamble Garden in Palo Alto. The gazebo acts as a focal point near the entrance to this garden, and it draws your eye along the paths that lead to it, and it gives your eye a place to settle. Here's another example of unity by dominance with this really nicely proportioned wood arbor here, connecting the two different areas of the garden and providing a sense of enclosure over this outdoor seating space. Here's a garden that's a little less formal than the previous one. This photo shows a Dr. Hurd manzanita with its lower limbs pruned up as a specimen shrub. As the manzanita matures, it'll become the focal point in this native plant garden. The Italian cypress in this picture of a private garden in Santa Cruz acts as a focal point in this grouping of plants and becomes the dominant statement, looking like an exclamation point here, but it draws our eye and it acts as a framework for the front door on this building. The bright red of the begonias in this slide is the dominant element in this garden, and the massed row planting unifies this grouping of coarse-leaved plants. A simple way to create a focal point is to put plants in a container. Make sure the style of the container is in keeping with the overall theme of the garden and the architecture of the house, and that its size is in proportion with other features in the landscape. I'm going to talk now about the unity of three. And this is another way of creating unity. Features that are grouped in threes or other odd numbers can give a stronger sense of unity to a planting scheme than plants planted in pairs. Subconsciously, our eyes always look for somewhere to settle. When we plant even numbers, our eye wants to divide those plants in half. But then our eye has nowhere to settle, and our eye goes backwards and forwards between the two plants or the two objects. And this visual division disrupts unity. If we group features or plants in odd numbers, our eye can't divide the grouping in half because it will always settle on the third or the fifth plant, and so unity is maintained. It's not necessary to use odd numbers, though, when the grouping of plants is larger than 5, as then our eye automatically sees a grouped planting of 6 or more as a mass. The exception to the rule of three is where we want to frame a view and lead our eye to that view or object. Perhaps it's the front door or a gate. Here's another example of the unity of three. So this is three planters planted with succulents and cacti, and then with the spherical piece of sculpture at the base, and the column here behind this planter acts as the fifth element here to provide a unity of five. Let's turn our attention now to another way of creating unity: simplicity. In applying simplicity, we're asking ourselves what's important and what's not important. We're adopting an approach of keeping a design simple and uncluttered. We avoid the one of everything or the patchwork quilt approach. And there are plenty of examples of this approach around town, in some of the new plantings in Aptos Village and in plenty of the commercial plantings along 41st Avenue. From a design point of view, it can be better to have a relatively small number of plant species. I think it was the English landscape designer John Brooks who once said something along the lines of, when you've finished a planting scheme, go back and halve the number of species and double the quantities. It's important to remember, though, that some variety can be important in order to create interest. As plant lovers, applying simplicity in our own gardens can be challenging. And I'll leave you with the question here: can a plant lover's or a plant collector's garden ever be well designed? A house and its landscape should sit well in the surrounding landscape. In this planting scheme by Bernard Traynor and Associates, the plant palette is restricted to grasses, and the muted colors blend with the surrounding landscape. The plant palette shows both simplicity and repetition of form and color. And we've arrived at the final principle of design: unity through interconnection. Unity through interconnection is achieved by the physical connection of various elements or features. When interconnection is used successfully, our eye moves smoothly from one part of the landscape to the next. In this design by Santa Cruz landscape architects Joni Janecki and Associates, interconnection is achieved through the small wall, which physically connects this outdoor room with the house. It's also achieved by using a similar plant palette from the house around both sides of the wall and back to the other side of the house. Note how the concept of an outdoor room has been created here by using a different surface. And notice too how the muted blue-grey tones of the foliage of the catmint here are similar to some of the greys in the stonework. There are also splashes of terracotta orange in the stone, which are picked up in the bright orange of the California poppies. A final comment on this picture. Note the change in form in grasses when they're mass planted close together, as they are here. From a distance, this is no longer a road planting of V-shaped grasses with spiky foliage, but a rectangle. I'm going to finish with two pictures of landscapes that have very little in the way of principles of design, as I think the contrast between these and some of the earlier photos might help illustrate some of the principles of design better. Arguably, the planting scheme in this photo has simplicity. After all, there aren't many plant species in this landscape. Let's think, though, about some of the other principles of design. There's no proportion. The two garden ornaments on the lawn are completely out of proportion to the size of the lawn, as is the narrow width of the planter bed to the left of the lawn. There's no interconnection between the features, and there's no balance. All of the visual weight is on the right side here, And there's nothing over here on the left side to balance that. Now that I've criticized this landscape, it begs the question, what would I do to make it better? And perhaps that's a question that we can tackle together in class. This last photo shows a landscape that's quite similar in a way to the previous slide, with a large central expanse of lawn surrounded by narrow planter beds. Again, there's no interconnection here, just individual plants or groupings of plants that have no relation to each other. Most of the plants have been allowed to develop their natural form, but the maintenance gardeners insist on pruning this shrub here and this one here that you can't see very well into tightly clipped blobs, in spite of the owners asking them to do otherwise. There's no proportion, there's no repetition, and no balance. So what would we do to create a well-designed planting scheme here? And that's another question that we can tackle together in class. Or perhaps we won't on this one. This garden actually belongs to my partner's 93-year-old aunt in Massachusetts, and she loves this garden. So now let's summarize what I've covered in this unit on the principles of design. The basic principles of design are scale and proportion, order and balance, repetition and unity. These principles provide us with guidelines for organizing the elements of design and landscape features to create an aesthetically pleasing landscape. The principles are strongly interlinked, and applying one of them usually helps achieve at least one of the others. Remember that these principles aren't formulae though, and their application doesn't necessarily guarantee a successful planting scheme. A successful planting scheme isn't just dependent on us creating an aesthetically pleasing design using the elements and principles of design. It's also dependent on us selecting the right plants for the climate, the soil conditions, wildlife, etc., and on us making sure the property owner is happy. So now, when you have time, head over to the short quiz on the use of the principles of design in a landscape.